Now, it's always been a fascinating question, I think, for all of us to contemplate what it actually means to talk about interpretation, specifically how to talk about commentaries and the difference between a commentary and a translation. This came up for me because some of my early work dealt with what I ended up calling simply a translation of the Qur'an into Arabic. And that seemed to be what some very brief commentaries really are. The matter of simply glossing the entire text word by word into different Arabic words, or by completing the sentences in order to make them full in their thoughts or in their grammar or whatever. And it raises some very interesting issues then when you start to think about this. What's the difference between a translation and a commentary? I think the point gets even more emphasized if we just contemplate even the way this is worked in English too. It's interesting that Arbery's translation of the Qur'an should be called the Qur'an interpreted. That is that, once again, perhaps it's merely a confusion, if you like, within the English words, but how we go about differentiating commentary, tafsīr, from translations of the Qur'an. It helps us think about what tafsīr actually is, what commentary is, what interpretation actually is, putting all those sorts of words together, but also raises some interesting issues. Clearly, I think most of us have come to an understanding of tafsīr as a linear following of the text of Scripture as being its most important characteristic. It's the additional sorts of things which get added in, such as the appeal to the authority of the past, a certain set of hermeneutical tools, which start to define what it is we are dealing with. And perhaps when one comes down to it, the best way of differentiating between commentary and translation is that what it is a long continuum, a continuum of complexity, ultimately, of translation as the most simple kind of commentary, interpretation, if you like, something that a translation into English quite clearly displays, moving all the way up onto a highly complex level. And that we must see the notion of interpretation, the idea of the genre of tafsīr, of translation, all of those things on a long continuum of complexity. But when I started to, the other thing that it's worth pointing to, and once again one of the interesting kinds of ways of understanding this continuum, would be to say that translation and the most simple commentary focus in on meaning, whereas commentary, as it gets more and more complex, also becomes very self-conscious about the process in which it's embarking upon. That is, that there are those reflexive kinds of ways of actually raising the question of, okay, so how do we interpret this? What are the various options, and so on and so forth. Another point about translation as compared to commentary, or once again, how these things get blended in together, is to reflect upon actually the purpose of translation in and by itself. And I think this, the cover of the book of Ziad al-Marsafi's book called The Enlightenment Qur'an, a recent study which has come out dealing with translations, especially George Sale's translation, and situating it within the intellectual environment of Europe at the time. And pointing out that translations of the Qur'an are not simply addressed to an audience in the target language who are interested in the text itself, But what al-Marsfi argues is that, in fact, the translation is embedded in arguments going on in the culture at the particular time, of arguments specifically going on within Christianity, and the way in which Islam becomes an example used within those kinds of debates over what is in fact correct Christian belief, and to use the contrast to Islam to talk about the dangers, for one, that certain doctrines within Christianity will lead Christians and so forth. My point here being to say that there are audiences which are not always immediately apparent for translations. It's a different cultural group, but it may not even be the immediately apparent audience which is the one for translations. Tafsīr, as we come to understand it, commentaries certainly in that broad sense, certainly do tend to be internally directed. That is, they are directed towards the internal community, in this case the Muslim community. They're not for missionizing purposes. They're not directed at other groups of people. They are for Muslims to understand the Qur'an itself. So we might also then be able to see some sorts of differentiations emerging there. But then that led me to start thinking then about, well, what about the translation of tafsir, this activity which we're seeing tremendously around the world as we're talking? There is, of course, as I already flashed, the ongoing activity sponsored through the Institute with this anthology of Quranic commentaries. There is another effort going on from the Royal Ahl Bayt Institute for Islamic Thought in Jordan, it's found on altafsir.org, doing a large number of translations of classical tafsirs. And this is an activity which has been going on for centuries, in fact. We can think back on some of the highlights of translations in this sort of way. Margoliouth's translation of Baydawi, Beeston's translation of Baydawi, of just sections of it, Gatcha's work of selections from Quranic commentaries and so forth. The question has to be, what's the purpose of translating tafsir? What does it actually, who's it directed to? What is its purpose? How does this relate to our understanding of what commentaries and translations might be? I love being in London because you have such great bookstores and you can get things which you can't get elsewhere. And yesterday, while I was wandering around, I managed to pick up a copy of the recent translation of Tafsir Jalalain done by Aisha Bewley. I hadn't been able to find it elsewhere until now. There's actually another translation of it has also come out from the Ahl Bayt Foundation as well. As those of you who know the tafsir tradition, you realize that this is it's a concise work. This has the Arabic text of the Qur'an printed in it as well. It's a text which is, in its Arabic, packed with grammatical niceties, a typical late medieval distillation of the entire tafsir tradition. Fundamental question has to be whether this can actually ever make sense in English. And supplementary to that then is, okay, and then who's it for if it can ever make any sense? Now, one of the audiences for a book like this, of course, is you and I, that is, scholars of the Qur'an. I'd be the first one to admit that if a translation of a text exists, I will readily turn to that as a first immediate guide. Why not? Somebody else has done all the hard work. It's much easier to turn to that to try and get oriented towards a text before diving in for oneself. And of course it then provides access for our students as well, for them to become acquainted with the literature in order for it to go on more and for them to engage in further and further studies. Translations, though, I think, have another group of people in mind, and that's what I would call the curious group. That is, people who are curious, not curious people. That they have ultimately a goal which goes beyond, in fact, the translation of the text itself. And I think, in fact, probably best displayed by the anthology of Quranic commentaries as a book. One of the goals, it seems to be, is to try to display the complexity and seriousness of Muslim thought. That is, of the depth of Muslim reflection upon the Qur'an. It isn't so much to tell us what the Qur'an means. It isn't so much to tell us how to understand a text of tafsīr, although once again it's very useful that sort of way. But really its goal seems to me to be, to try and convey a message which goes well beyond that. That Muslims, in fact, are not slavishly, literally driven by they are not tied to a literal sense of the text, but engaged, in fact, deeply engaged in intellectual reflection upon the text. That is, they have basically a purpose which fits within the contemporary context of trying to understand Muslim identity. But there's a third group, quite clearly, for whom such translations are directed, and that is the Muslim community itself. That is, Muslims who wish to undertake independent study of the Qur'an, who don't have the Arabic tools for themselves to be able to undertake this sort of task. This is particularly interesting, and I will reflect upon this further as I go along, but it clearly is also reflective of a particularly modern situation, of the modern emphasis upon individualism within religion, which is certainly strongly felt in all religions and in Islam these days. That is, that the sense in which individuals are no longer tied to a scholarly community, no longer tied to a community at all, but are in a position to make individual decisions about their religious faith, to investigate it themselves, to come to their own personal understanding of their relationship to Scripture, a very Protestant kind of approach to religion, ultimately. This particularly comes out, and this is the reason I have Jalalain here, the translation with me, particularly comes out in the preface to this work. Actually, the foreword by the publisher, Hajj Ahmed Thompson, talking about the reason for this translation. Those who are well versed in classical Arabic can refer to any of the standard tafsīrs they may find. But what of the Muslim whose mother tongue is not Arabic? How can he or she begin to approach the meanings of the Qur'an without being daunted at the outset? How can the seeker's hunger for knowledge be both satisfied and further stimulated without risk of either an overdose or indigestion? The answer is to refer to a reliable translation of the text, and also to a reliable translation of at least one authoritative commentary. Such a resource is now available in the full translation of Tafsīr al-Jalalain, a work renowned for its clarity, for its simplicity, for its concision while including all the essential elements, and for its clear explanations of points of Arabic grammar. The Bewleys go on to talk a little bit more about why they undertook this translation. They say that because most of the tafsirs are in Arabic, all the seminal works are in the original Arabic, this is meant for a great majority of English-speaking Muslims An amplified understanding of the Quranic ayahs was dependent on people possessing a high level of Arabic, or limited to those modern commentaries which do exist in English, but which lack the authority of the great works of the classical commentators. However, they go on to say, many comments of a grammatical nature have not been included in this translation because a reasonably advanced level of Arabic is needed to appreciate them. So they're only really useful for people who would be better off studying them in the original language anyway. And this points to a certain tension, it seems to me, in this entire activity over translation of tafsīr. That is, that it is, in fact, deeply embedded in a scholarly tradition, which is ultimately extremely difficult to get outside of that. And in fact, reading classical commentators and their reflections upon what tafsīr is all about makes this point very, very clearly. Reading recently about Al-Wahidi in the 11th century, who makes specifically the argument that reading all the old tafsirs won't do you any good unless you are thoroughly steeped in grammar and the elaborations of the qualities of the Arabic language. That is, that all the material will ultimately be meaningless. Fakhruddin al-Razi in the 12th, 13th century, likewise making the same sort of sense of the need for a solid grounding in rational knowledge before one can ever hope to tap into the body of tafsir and to gain anything from it. So the particular activity of the translation of tafsir in modern times is one which is very much reflective of a modern situation, of a particular understanding of what religion is all about, of an individual's relationship to a scriptural text as very much being a part of individualism, and that sense in which there are ways of simply, or the hope that there are ways of expanding the meaning of the text through this kind of simplification, distillation of the classical tafsir tradition. But that then led me to start thinking about what then of the scholarly study of tafsir. What's that really about? What is our goal in undertaking such things? Are we, when we're studying these sorts of things, actually interested in the Qur'an, or are we interested in commentary, interpretation as a thing in and by itself? And one of the interesting things which I think I've noted in the progression of the scholarly study of tafsir over the last years is that I think as a discipline we've started to move away from seeing tafsir as a compendium of meaning which we can bring to the text of the Qur'an to try and help us understand it, and seeing more of it as the study of tafsir as really as the study of hermeneutics, of understanding the methods of Muslim commentators, of how scholars in the past and the present understand the process of interpretation, the context in which the interpretations arise, the goals, their place in the educational system, all those sort of things. That transformation has come about, it seems to me, because we've come to a greater appreciation of what commentaries are all about. The commentaries are in fact not all about extracting or clarifying the meaning of the text at all. Tafsir is not about meaning so much as it is about defending the integrity, the perfection, the completeness, the intelligibility, the meaningfulness of the scriptural text, all of which is driven by the actual historical, cultural position of the interpreter, the need to respond to newly emerging pressures which affect the intelligibility of the text, and so on and so forth. Our scholarly study still has a long way to go in terms of fully understanding what that means, how that happens, the kinds of developments which have taken place. But it does seem to me that this is the direction in which scholarly studies go. To me, this was an interesting point to try to realize in reflecting upon this. Back in 1983, I published an article which is still cited occasionally, much to my surprise, The Qur'an as Literature, Perils, Pitfalls, and Prospects. It was derived from a talk which I gave in 1981, I think, when I was still a recently minted, highly enthusiastic PhD, wherein my enthusiasm and confidence for the future was quite manifest. And there I argued for a notion of reception history as embedded in tafsīr as the best approach to the Qur'an in order to produce a scholarly reading of the text itself. It's the kind of reading that one might say is modeled in something like Jane Smith's work from 1975, a historical and semantic study of the term Islam, and also, I think, say in Jane McAuliffe's work, Quranic Christians, where there's an attempt to use tafsīr throughout a stretch of history to look at the way in which meaning has evolved. That doesn't seem to me to be any more the particular direction of tafsīr studies of commentaries. When I look now at works like Walid Saleh's work on Al-Thahlabi, Andrew Lane's work on Zamakhshari, these are works which clearly focus in on the actual process of interpretation, of how meaning is created. They're not interested so much in the meaning of the texts themselves, but much more in the entire process. And this does seem to me to be the way in which the discipline is moving. That's interesting then too, in that sense of that stands in somewhat in tension with this notion of translating tafsīr as an actual project, once again raising questions over what that's for. I say that on one hand, but then I want to argue partially against myself, again. That is to say, reflecting on a paper which I gave just a few months ago, to make the point also, though, that I think we always need to keep in mind in what we do, is that when we do try to understand the Qur'an, we often have to do so from within the tafsīr tradition. So if we actually have an interest in trying to understand the Qur'an, it becomes increasingly apparent to me that we can't actually escape from the tafsīr tradition if we wish to say anything about the text itself. And that was there. Just briefly touch on an example which I have developed in another paper dealing with this word ta, found in the Qur'an, which, if you look in commentaries or in dictionaries of the Qur'an, which is how it came to my particular attention in reviewing some recently published dictionaries of the Qur'an, can either mean an acacia tree or it can mean a banana tree, which seem to me to be two radically different things. They have a certain common element in them, which means a sense of trees providing shade, which, as we'll see within the context of the Qur'an, is what it's all about. But obviously, the meanings themselves are quite different. The debate between the two meanings is quite clear in some senses. The word ta today means an acacia tree, as found in Africa and Arabia. The question then becomes a historical one. Can one project backwards from today to the 7th century Quranic Arabic in order to say that that is what this particular word means? There have been lots of studies of the way in which, in fact, the lexicography of the Qur'an has affected Arabic usage. Can we ever actually determine what this word meant back in the 7th century? It may mean acacia tree now. Did it mean that in the 7th century? It could have meant bananas. Apparently bananas were known in 7th century Mediterranean. This isn't inconceivable. Those two meanings are definitely there. Of course, it's actually even more complicated than that when you start looking into it further, because some people suggest that actually it's not, maybe it's not, it's a particular kind of banana. It could be a plantain, for example, rather than our communal garden banana. How do we know what words mean in the Quran, especially words such as this? That's amazing. This is the particular passage in which this word is used in the Quran, talking about the reward of those of the righteous in the hereafter, where they will sit mid thornless lote trees, and in Arbery's translation, serried acacia trees. Spreading shade, these trees will do. It's not a particularly transparent passage. It's a word which has multiple applications. We are, the only point here being, we are in fact fully indebted to whatever the tafsīr tradition, whatever the commentary tradition has given to us for ever getting to any particular understanding of this passage. Now, we actually can't, I would say, we can't make a decision as to whether it's going to be acacia trees or banana trees or plantains or whatever, but our range of meanings, in fact, the only place it is embedded is within the tafsīr tradition. So it's not as though our study of tafsīr can simply be one about tafsīr as an enterprise in itself. It is, we are still fully embedded within the tafsīr tradition in order to understand anything about the Quran at all. But that's exaggerating. There clearly is other evidence available for historical use of Arabic and so on and so forth. We have inscriptions and coins and poetry and all those sorts of things. But fundamentally, if we do wish to say anything about the Quran, then we will still always end up with talking about tafsīr. Final point then to raise is the notion of where then is the study of tafsīr going? What does the future hold? And in some attempt to bring all this sorts of stuff together. I've had a long-standing interest in the movement of tafsīr into electronic form, away from the printed text and so forth. And this is something which has certainly seen a significant transformation in the last 10 years. The Quran itself and a vast body of classical commentaries are available via the internet, both in Arabic and increasingly in English in translation form. There are literally hundreds, if probably not thousands, of texts now available. There are a number of aspects to this, and I will just touch on some of them before moving towards tafsīr as such, because we need to think about this in broader terms of what it means for text to move to this kind of online format. There's been a lot of work on putting the text of the Quran on the internet. This has been going on for many years. In fact, there have been downloadable texts available. Early forms of computer encoding which were popular didn't allow for vowels, for example, so there are lots of unvoweled text always used to be available, and so on and so forth. But as technology has evolved, the ability to be able to represent the text of the Qur'an on the internet has also been enhanced. Today, the real efforts seem to be at embedding the entire Cairo text within a character sets on the internet. So not representing it simply graphically, but having it all represented as individual characters on the text on the internet. This is actually very interesting because what it's doing is making the Cairo text even more authoritative. That is, that a text created in the 1920s, 1930s has become viewed, and there are several articles which definitely deal with it this way. It's become definitely viewed as the text which must be established for it to be the Qur'an on the internet. And that one must be sure that one can represent absolutely every ligature as it is present on the Cairo printed text on the internet before one can safely say that this is the Qur'an. This is an interesting transformation of our understanding of the Qur'an and of Scripture and all those sorts of things as a result of it being in electronic form. Proliferation of translations of the Qur'an. One of the internet sites love to do this as a part of documenting how many languages the Qur'an is available in, for example. And so one gets a kind of missionizing element to all of this to show the worldwide distribution of the Qur'an and how effective this is and so forth. It's also the same with recitations. The proliferation of the number of recitations that one can get on the internet these days is once again absolutely enormous. The other point, and closer to what I'm supposed to be talking about, it's very interesting the way in which a canonization of tafsīr, of the genre of tafsīr, is taking place. That is, that there are some texts which are becoming extremely widespread, Ibn Kathir being the obvious example of one which is found absolutely everywhere. But even when one starts to expand this a little bit further onto any kind of ready reference text, even altafsir.org, there's still a limited number of texts, and they gain a certain canonization by being there. They are the limits, if you like, on which the references are being suggested. The number, once again, here the number of texts that are available is enormous. I took a couple of screenshots. They're rather difficult to read from a distance, I can tell you this. This is mishkat.net, and this is a sample page of Ulum al-Quran, the Fada'il text of Abu Ubaid, down to what have we got here? Iqrab al-Quran from Suyuti, Akhfash's Ma'ani al-Quran, just everything, and it goes on and on and on, all reproduced in electronic format. Then when one gets to tafsirs, one can see the entire distribution of them here as well, in all the standard major tafsirs and lots of minor ones as well, ready to be downloaded either in PDF or text form, ready for whatever you want to do. And tafsir.org, with its drop-down list of all the tafsirs in this instance, all there ready for access. Far more, Walid tells me he has perhaps 80 texts in bookcases, on books on his shelves. There's probably more here, more than even Walid has in his own personal library, which I always consider an amazing accomplishment. But there are actually more texts available online than any of us could ever hope to own within our own library. This is an interesting phenomenon, and the impact of it is one which will be considerable in the future, but it's also interesting in the sense of suggesting what its limits are as well. And this is something where thinking about this in what we often call the digital humanities, those of you who are interested in such things will recognize the kind of terminology, but the perspectives and concerns that digital humanities might have when then contemplating this electronic existence of tafsīr material. What's it all about? What's its cultural significance? And so on and so forth. Democratization of access to primary materials is a common theme in extolling digital humanities in general. It's getting it out of the hands of the publishers, of the elite, putting it into the hands of the common person. Of course, democratization is a highly charged word within the context of Islam. Islamic studies as a whole, whether we're dealing with human rights issues or the war on terror, or one might say, by extension, therefore, access to texts. But even if we simply term it easy access, even then it's only easy access for those who have the resources to access it, we can acknowledge that such access is certainly important, significant, but still not much has really changed for Muslims in dealing with the Qur'an and its interpretation online, except in that symbolic sense. If we consider the projects which digital humanities has in front of it, we can see that there's still a long way to go in terms of making any particular impact. Mere access to the material doesn't make it any easier to understand. There's still a need for a scholarly class of readers, and thus perhaps some of the emphasis upon translation. What we really have so far is simply an accumulation of data. There's no evidence that there's any sort of process of change in the process of analysis of the text or even in their compilation. All we have are reproduced books, or even worse, reproduced books without any particular credit to those books either. We don't have any real advance in knowledge by this. There's no refined indexing of the works. There's no additional editing documentation. There's nothing suggesting synthesization of the available material. No emergence of new super commentaries. No way of facilitating advanced analysis or adding pieces. No tools for true collaborative research or thinking. Although I did want to point at least to al-Zikr, which for the text of the Qur'an has become very much a collaborative process of evolving a text of the Qur'an, once again in its true Cairo representation, and the wiki dealing with this particular text both on its technical issues but also on a textual level certainly starts to show the ways in which some of that kind of collaborative research can work on a very limited text. After all, the text of the Qur'an is relatively small, but what could be thought to be possible in the future for tafsīr. Much of this actually seems to celebrate more the technical accomplishment than anything beyond that. What then would I say very quickly, mindful of the time that I'm keeping you all from what I understand is lunch out there, so I will be brief. What's the main impact of all of this? What seems to be really the issue as we see it now? All the questions revolve around the preservation of culture and who ultimately controls that. So once again, it is very much a symbolic act of gathering texts together, of who will facilitate access to such texts. It's fascinating that it took a while, but tafsīr.org has Tafsīr Muqatil, which of course would be sort of one of those texts which would not necessarily be found on every website for text downloading. But the point being that what one puts there does have certain cultural connotations. It does indicate who does and doesn't have access, who controls it. They are basically political questions, questions of how to define the canon of classical works as it will move ahead. So, in conclusion, I would certainly say that the academic study of tafsīr is alive and well and even flourishing. That's what I hope this collection of musings has suggested. The Middle Eastern publishing industry and now the Arab interest in the internet has made available quantities of material never seen before, although much lies still untapped and much of it remains certainly unappreciated, barely having been read with a scholarly eye. I made the remark in the 2004 reprint of Wandsborough's Quranic Studies that in the 30 years since the publication of the first edition of that book, virtually all of the material which Wandsborough had to look at in manuscript was available in printed editions. And now, just 6 years after that, after I wrote that statement, a majority of those texts are now in fact available freely on the internet. This access to source material makes the field of study so much more viable, but so much more overwhelming given the sheer quantity available. It means that the tendency to ransack the tafsīr tradition in search of meanings of the Qur'an, something I lamented back in 1981, the article I mentioned, that as an activity is even more meaningless than ever. The tradition itself simply cannot be encompassed given the dimensions of it that are available to us today. That the scholarly focus becomes hermeneutics only makes sense in light of that fact, and it is also, to me now, the most meaningful way to approach the material. Of course, there are other things that can be done with tafsīr, as illustrated by the translation endeavors, and in tafsīr's inherent value as a distillation of Islamic culture in relationship to the Qur'an itself. But all those things seem to point, to me, to a field which is exciting and rewarding one, certainly for me to be in. So, thank you.